Welcome to the Feminine Principle podcast, supporting women to let go of the ghosts from their past by exploring the hidden side of their female psyche with shamanic shadow work for women, with your host, Nicola Lucy. Welcome to this episode of the Feminine Principle podcast, where today we are exploring boundaries. And so boundaries, obviously they are a necessity. We need them. You know, they help us to explore our edges, and they also help us to explore the basic principles of safety and danger. And so growing up, you know, we learn certain boundaries. We learn, you know, to stay away from the fire, don't go near the water, don't run onto the road. These are all boundaries which are practiced by our parents or by our caregivers to give us that sense of understanding of the danger that is there in the world at large. And so we need them. But then obviously our boundaries as we've grown up have become more and more conditioned. And so one example of this is, you know, my mum, she was afraid of the sea. And so every time we went on a holiday, you know, her fear of the sea would really push back onto me. And it was only when I moved to Italy in my late 20s and suddenly being exposed to the sea, to the Mediterranean life, that I realized that I'd also inherited her deep fear of the sea. And I felt very much unsafe there. And so it took me time and a lot of patience from my partner to help me ease back into the sea and to find the sea as a place of pleasure. It's a beautiful experience to be able to swim. But that boundary that was created within me, which gave me fear of the sea, had to be eased away so that I could explore what was beyond that boundary, that limitation within myself. And so I really was able to come back into natural harmony with the sea, and I enjoy it now. But this is just an example of how our conditioning in regards to boundaries do come in. And so boundaries, they are places of limitation, but also of our potential. And so when we explore the limitations within the self, these are boundaries that we have created within the self that actually limits our potential. And so we can experience this in all areas of our life, whether that is in our career, whether that is in our relationship to love, whether that is in relationship to our family or our friends or our leisure activities even. And so they create those limitations. So we all have that kind of cutoff point, you know, if we're going out with the girls and we don't want to drink too much alcohol. And so we know our cutoff point, we know our limit, and therefore we are respecting our boundaries. You know, when we're in the car, for example, we know that we shouldn't drive over a certain speed, and therefore we respect the boundary. And so these boundaries, we can see them constantly being activated in our lives. But then when it comes to those deeper relationships within the self and with others, our boundaries can become very inhibiting. They can really take us to the edge, but then it kicks off so much fear within the self of going over the edge. And so therefore we stay hidden, you know, we stay small, we stay kind of trapped within the self, and we stay stuck. But these limitations, you know, they are simply there within our own psyche, showing us that if we dare, we can go beyond that limitation and we can go into more of our potential. And so the boundaries, when we look at them as these limitations within the psyche, they are all built upon our relationship with the fundamental aspects of our human behavior, which is safety, security, and stability. Now, these three fundamental aspects of our human nature, you know, they create and manifest our reality continuously. So if we don't feel safe, we will retreat. And if we don't feel secure, then we'll behave in a certain way. And if we don't feel stable, we'll react in a certain way. So we can see how safety and security and stability is always triggering this sense of boundaries within the self. And we all know, sometimes we are afraid to push our boundaries. We're afraid to go beyond the boundary and expand into our potential. And so we can see this continuously in our dialogue with the self and with others, is that we would prefer to stay safe. We want to stay in our comfort zone. This is more important. And we can see that also in the realms of stability. We would prefer to be doing or working in a career or a job, for example, which gives us a sense of stability. And yet it completely and utterly hinders our creative potential. And so these are the ways in which we start to really break down and look at where our limitations are and where is our potential. And so we also can recognize, where we've had no boundaries. So we can just have a look back through our lives and we can recognize where we have given everything that we are, everything that we own, everything that we exist for to somebody else, to a relationship, whether that be to a career, whether that be to a person. And we can give us so much of ourselves to the other person or to this aspect of our life that we completely lose our sense of self. And that's simply because we don't recognize our own boundaries and what we are giving more than we are receiving. And so when this comes into it, when we start to experience this imbalance between giving and receiving, this naturally triggers our lack of boundaries within the self. And we can actually feel it when our boundaries have been triggered, but we might not recognize it intellectually. So, for example, when our boundaries have been triggered, we're going to be having these feelings of resentment or bitterness or anxiety or depression even. And we can feel them churning. And, so one of the emotions that I've worked with quite regularly is resentment. We can feel that resentment building up inside when our boundaries have been pushed, or when somebody has overstepped the mark with us, and it's simply because we don't know how to communicate our boundaries. We actually don't even know what our boundaries are. And so therefore, instead of being able to stand in our power and assert our boundaries, what we end up doing is having this resentment, this bitterness being triggered within the self. And we all know the story. Somebody has overstepped the mark. We have given more of ourselves than we wish to give. And we have this constant mind chatter bubbling away in the head, which is that grungy kind of energy that we just stay in that drama going over and over and over and over again. Well, every time that we are triggered in this way, all of our energy, all of our creative potential and power is being fed into feeding that resentment, that bitterness, that anxiety, that depression. And it's just focusing more and more and more on that. And whereas when we learn how to assert our boundaries, that we understand and respect that our boundaries have been crossed and that we have allowed them to be crossed, we can then take that energy which has been feeding into that vicious cycle of the resentment and the bitterness. We can actually take that and we can feed it then into our own creative power and potential, and feed it into the relationships, into the aspects of our life that actually bring us pleasure and joy rather than suffering and pain. However, because we don't know our boundaries, we are unconsciously choosing to stay stuck in those unhealthy relationships, not only with others, but with the self. And so we're putting more and more stress on the self and more stress on our relationships, because basically what we're doing is instead of asserting our boundaries, we are simply putting up and shutting up. And we're staying in all that negative kind of low vibrational energy of just churning it out, which then obviously has an effect on our bodies. It has an effect on our physical self because we're not able to fully digest it. You know, it's very difficult to digest these very uncomfortable and discomforting emotions. And so then this then upsets the whole of our biological system. And then that then manifests in illness or syndromes or disorders or complications within the body. And so we can really start to experience how simply not being able to assert or communicate our boundaries in a healthy way can have a massive knock-on effect to the relationship we have with ourselves and our bodies and the relationship that we have with others. And you know, one of the reasons why we are so afraid of asserting our boundaries is that we are afraid of being rejected or abandoned or unloved by the other person. You know, we're so afraid of being sent into exile, to be alone and to be ostracized, that it's much easier, and this is kind of where the paradox comes in, it's much easier to stay in the suffering than it is to engage our personal power. Because we're afraid, we've never done it before, so how do we know what's on the other side of it? And we're so afraid of losing the love or the care or the support or from the other person, remembering that that's just a perception of love, support and care from the other person. And so therefore we're so afraid of it that we will sacrifice the self. We will sacrifice our boundaries. We will sacrifice our needs to stay in that unhealthy relationship and keep allowing that same pattern to repeat itself over and over and over again. And so I'm sure that there's been many opportunities in your life that you can look back at all the people in your life or the aspects of your life that have triggered this lack of boundaries, and where you have felt that energy start to come up which churns and churns and churns inside the self, and it doesn't really do you any favors. I'm sure you can think of many instances where this has happened. And so choosing, you know, albeit unconsciously, we are choosing unconsciously to stay in the suffering rather than assert our power and experience our potential. So we would prefer to stay in the limitation of no boundaries, or we would prefer, instead of stepping over that limitation and feeling that inner sense of our personal power come in and saying, actually, no, this is not right, or this is not good, or this is not acceptable. And so one of my clients recently mentioned, you know, that when she started to learn her boundaries was that it was like a muscle which had been left dormant. And the more in which she asserted this muscle, the more that she could feel this personal power coming in. And I think that this is a really good description of how we can, not just boundaries, but any aspect of what is hidden in the female psyche, is that when we start to exercise these dormant muscles, which have always been there, you know, our ability to assert and communicate boundaries has always been there. It's there inside of the self, but it's just been buried underneath wounding and trauma and conditioning that we might not be aware of. And so we simply have to dig through all of that mud to get to that treasure trove of all of these little bits of our personal power, which are our muscles. You know, we can exercise them. We can bring more of them into themselves. And so therefore we are building from the ground up our inner foundation of personal power. And boundaries is just one aspect of this personal power. And so another aspect of boundaries, you know, is learning how to engage in tough love. You know, so we know tough love. We know the meaning of the word tough love, but it's not always easy to assert it. And this is something that we explore as kind of like the shadow side of the mother. So we can all recognize the mother energy within the feminine psyche, within the female psyche, where when the mother is always giving too much of herself to others, to support others, to nurture others, to make sure that everybody else is okay, instead of the self. And so, when this shadow side of the mother is active, we are giving and giving and giving, and we're not receiving. And therefore it's created this massive imbalance within the self. And so learning tough love is about learning how to also be selfish. And this is really quite challenging for women, because being selfish is something that is not looked upon in society as deemed healthy or positive or good. And therefore, when we are classified, when we are labeled as selfish, it makes us look, or we internalize it, that we are not worthy. We're not good people. We are somehow bad, and we're not deserving of love and support. And so therefore it can be this double-edged sword. And so learning how to break down this double-edged sword of recognizing that, to be able to listen to our own boundaries and respect our own boundaries when we have allowed somebody else to cross the mark, to cross that line. It's our responsibility. We have allowed that to happen. And so therefore, when we learn how to be selfish, it's not that we are being selfish because it's coming from that ego place of wanting to control and dominate other people. It's from being able to wanting to dominate and control our own environment and really regulate our own energy and vitality so that we're able to nurture and nourish the self. And so there's a real thin line, with exercising this ability to be selfish, to exercise tough love, when we have to say, no, it stops here, because I cannot give more than I have to give. I cannot do this anymore because it's creating so much imbalance and so much unhealthy aspects of my own biology, of my own inner tapestry, that we have to draw the line. And so, when we start to learn boundaries and we start to learn tough love, we are actually stepping into that light side, that powerful side of the mother that knows how much to give, but then also knows when it is her time to receive. And not necessarily just receiving from other people. It's about learning how to receive self-love and self-care so that we're able to maintain that inner balance. But then also exercising tough love as a boundary and really working that dynamic within the self. Not only does it help us to then channel our own energy into our own creative projects and our creative potential that bring us pleasure and joy, but it also helps the other person that we are exercising that boundary with to learn how to respect their own boundaries and to learn something about themselves in regards to that boundary. Now, exercising our boundaries is never simple, and it's not always easy, because when we do assert our boundaries, the other person may not respect that boundary. And this can be quite tricky because, as I mentioned earlier, we're afraid of exercising our boundaries because we're afraid that we will be rejected or abandoned or exiled or ostracized. And so we don't do it. And so when we do start to assert our boundaries, there is the potential that other people will not understand why we have asserted this boundary. And this can become quite tricky because obviously we don't want to enter into any more psychodrama, but we want to just be able to communicate our boundaries effectively. And so what I've learned through my own personal practice and obviously working with clients is that when we do exercise our boundaries, if the other person is not willing to accept that boundary, then there is absolutely nothing at all that we can do about it. That is their choice, and they have absolutely every right to make that choice. But how we respond to that choice is part of us learning that boundary. And so when we start to really engage in this dynamic on a day-to-day basis, it does become quite triggering, because we actually start to lose people in our lives. And people who we thought that were our lives, or that were so supportive and so caring and so loving, that the moment that we exercise our boundary, that love and support and care and everything else has been taken away from us. And so what's actually happening in that moment is that the illusion that relationship was created upon disintegrates. And so we actually start to see things for exactly how they are. We start to see the nature of that relationship for exactly what it is. So rather than creating that illusion which was coming from our own instability, insecurity, and feelings of unsafe, suddenly we're starting to see how that relationship was really created. And it was created to give us a false sense of self. And so exercising the boundary has created that stronger inner sense of self, and therefore the illusion is allowed to crumble. And so what is happening, the more boundaries that we learn to assert, the more that we are stepping into our power and our potential as human beings. And we are also changing the way in which we relate to the self and in which we relate to others. We are making it very clear that this is the limitation that I am willing to accept within. And therefore I'm not willing to sacrifice myself, my creativity, my life, or a certain part of my life for more of this pain and suffering. And so it really starts to become such an abundant way to experience the self by simply checking in and experiencing when our boundaries have been crossed. And so, a few questions for you to ponder. What is your experience of boundaries? How have you learnt boundaries in your life? Where have you also allowed your boundaries to be overstepped? And where are you not taking responsibility for your boundaries? And then just gently glancing and experiencing, who in your life triggers your boundaries the most? Where do you feel that resentment and bitterness all the time? In which relationships, which dynamics, which aspects of your life. And this is simply showing us where we need to now pay attention. Because moving forward, in the world in which we have found ourselves in, is that boundaries and respecting our boundaries, respecting our needs to come first and foremost. Because if we are not able to respect our boundaries or our needs, then how can we expect others to respect them? And not only that, but how can we expect our children to be able to understand the potent nature of boundaries if we don't have any boundaries ourselves? And so really, boundaries are one of the foundational blocks of our personal power. And the more that we can really start to tap into where we are not respecting our boundaries, the more that we can bring them back into balance within the self and therefore in our relationships with others. Are you ready to break free from the ghosts of your past, to live with more freedom and a clear sense of purpose and inner confidence? If so, book a chat with me to explore the potent magic of one-to-one shadow walking sessions at thefeminineprinciple.com.